13-year-old boy murders his mother acting untouchable. Then the judge made history 13 years old. That's how young he was when he sat in that interrogation room, leaning back like he owned the place. His shoe tapped against the metal table leg in a rhythm that felt almost mocking. Detectives stood frozen, whispering to each other because they'd never seen anything like this. Not from a child, not after what had just happened inside that quiet suburban home. He lifted his chin, stared directly into the camera mounted in the corner, and smirked. It wasn't nervousness. It wasn't fear. It was arrogance. On the table in front of him sat a single piece of evidence he couldn't explain away. A time-stamped search on his phone, typed just minutes before everything shattered. He believed his age would protect him. He thought the system couldn't touch him, but he had no idea that the judge assigned to his case was about to make legal history. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. This is how it all began. The boy sitting in that cold room wasn't always like this. Or maybe he was, and the signs were just ignored for too long. His mother had been a nurse, the kind of woman who worked double shifts and still came home to make dinner. Neighbors described her as patient beyond measure, the type who believed love could fix anything. But love has limits. And on one silent morning in a neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen, those limits were tested in the most unthinkable way. Officers arrived at her home after her sister couldn't reach her. What they found inside would launch an investigation unlike any their department had seen, because the only other person in that house, the last person to see her alive, was her own son. And when they finally tracked him down, he wasn't hiding. He was sitting on a park swing, eating a snack, acting like it was just another ordinary day. Her name was Rebecca Matthews, and everyone who knew her said the same thing. She gave too much of herself. At 38 years old, she had spent the last 15 years working as a registered nurse at the county hospital, pulling night shifts that left her exhausted but never too tired to show up for her son. Her co-workers remembered her as the one who always volunteered for the hardest cases, the patients nobody else wanted to deal with. She had a way of making people feel seen, even in their darkest moments. That same compassion defined her life at home, though it came with a cost nobody fully understood until it was too late. Rebecca lived in a modest two-bedroom house on Maple Grove Drive, a quiet cul-de-sac where neighbors waved at each other and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Her home was small but warm, filled with touches that revealed her devotion. Framed drawings from her son's elementary school years still hung in the hallway, even though he was 13 now and had long since stopped creating art. The refrigerator was covered in magnets holding up school schedules, grocery lists, and a single photograph of the two of them at a carnival 3 years earlier. In that picture, he was smiling. She had her arm around his shoulder. It felt like a memory from another lifetime. Those who knew Rebecca well understood that motherhood hadn't been easy for her. She had raised her son alone since he was 2, after his father left without warning and never came back. She never spoke bitterly about it. Instead, she poured everything into making sure her son had stability, structure, and unconditional love. Teachers at his middle school knew her by name because she attended every parent conference, every open house, every school event she could fit into her chaotic schedule. When he got into trouble, which had been happening more frequently over the past 2 years, she was the first one to show up and the last one to leave. She believed in second chances. She believed in him, but belief can only carry you so far. In the months leading up to that silent morning, Rebecca had confided in her older sister Angela that something was changing. She didn't use dramatic language or express panic, but there was worry in her voice during their phone calls. She told Angela that her son had become distant, that he barely spoke to her anymore unless he wanted something. She mentioned arguments over screen time, over grades, over basic household rules that he refused to follow. Angela had suggested therapy, maybe even a family counselor. Rebecca agreed it was a good idea. She just needed to find the right person, the right time, the right words to convince him to go. She never got the chance. Her co-workers at the hospital noticed the exhaustion settling deeper into her eyes. Rebecca had always been tired. That came with the job, but this was different. One of the other nurses, a woman named Diane, who had worked alongside her for over a decade, remembered a conversation they had in the break room just 3 weeks before everything happened. Rebecca had been staring at her phone, reading a text message that made her frown. Diane asked if everything was okay. Rebecca hesitated, then smiled in that practiced way people do when they don't want to burden anyone else. She said her son was going through a phase, that all teenagers pushed boundaries. Diane nodded, but later she would tell investigators that something about Rebecca's expression stayed with her. It wasn't just worry. It was something closer closer to fear. Rebecca's final week was ordinary in all the ways that make tragedy feel even more unbearable. She worked her usual shifts, picked up groceries, paid bills, sent reminder texts to her son about homework. She attended a short meeting with his school counselor after he'd been caught skipping class. The counselor noted that Rebecca seemed overwhelmed but determined. She promised to set firmer boundaries at home, to take away privileges if needed. She didn't want her son to spiral. She still believed she could reach him. On her last day at work, she clocked out at 11:30 at night, exhausted from back-to-back shifts. A security camera in the hospital parking lot captured her walking to her car, shoulders slumped, carrying a bag of leftover food from the cafeteria. She drove home through empty streets, unaware that she had less than 2 hours left. Angela would later tell detectives that her sister had sent her a text message 2 nights before she died. It was brief, just a few sentences, but the words haunted Angela afterward. Rebecca had written, "I think I'm losing him. I don't know how to get through anymore." Angela had responded with encouragement, suggestions, reassurance that things would get better. Rebecca never replied. The silence should have been a warning, but hindsight always carries that cruel clarity. When Angela tried calling the next morning and got no answer, she assumed her sister was sleeping after a long shift. She tried again an hour later, then again. By noon, panic had set in. Angela drove to the house, knocked on the door, peered through windows, and finally called the police. What happened next would unravel everything Rebecca had tried so desperately to hold together. From the outside, the house on Maple Grove Drive looked like every other home on the block. Neat lawn, trimmed hedges, a small porch with 2 chairs that nobody ever sat in. The mailbox had a little dent in the side from where a baseball had hit it years ago, and the front door was painted a soft blue that Rebecca had chosen because she thought it looked welcoming. Neighbors passed by every day without giving it a second glance. It was the kind of place where you'd expect to find a family living a quiet, unremarkable life. But inside those walls, pressure had been building for months, and nobody on the outside could see the cracks forming. The boys' bedroom was on the 2nd floor, directly above the living room. It was cluttered in the way teenage rooms often are, with clothes piled on a chair, school papers scattered across a desk, and posters of video game characters taped to the walls. But there were other details that painted a darker picture. His gaming console was surrounded by energy drink cans and snack wrappers, evidence of late-night sessions that stretched well past any reasonable bedtime. His school backpack sat in the corner, unopened for days, assignments untouched. On his desk, buried under old homework, were several printed disciplinary warnings from the school: disrespectful behavior toward teachers, repeated violations of the technology policy, aggressive language directed at classmates. Rebecca had tried to address each one, but her efforts were met with indifference or outright hostility. The arguments had started small. Rebecca would ask him to turn off the game and do his homework. He would ignore her. She would ask again, her voice a little firmer. He would roll his eyes, tell her she was overreacting, that he'd do it later. Later never came. The cycle repeated itself night after night, each confrontation leaving Rebecca more drained than the last. She tried taking away his console for a weekend. He exploded, shouting at her in a way that made her step back. She returned the console after 2 days, hoping that showing trust would encourage better behavior. It didn't. Instead, he learned that if he pushed hard enough, she would give in. Neighbors heard the escalation even if they didn't fully understand what was happening. The Johnsons, who lived in the house to the right, mentioned to investigators that they'd heard raised voices several times over the past few months. They couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakable: frustration, anger, defiance. Mrs. Johnson recalled one evening in particular, about 3 weeks before Rebecca's death, when she heard something crash inside the house next door. She almost went over to check but decided against it, not wanting to intrude. She regretted that decision later, wondering if her intervention might have changed the course of events. It's a burden she still carries. The school had tried to intervene as well. A counselor named Mr. Brennan had reached out to Rebecca after the boy was caught threatening another student during lunch. The threat wasn't physical, but it was disturbing enough that the school felt it needed to be documented. Mr. Brennan recommended therapy, possibly even a psychological evaluation. Rebecca agreed immediately, but when she brought it up at home, her son refused. He told her there was nothing wrong with him, that everyone else was the problem. She tried to convince him, tried to explain that talking to someone might help. He walked out of the room mid-sentence. That was the end of the conversation. Rebecca's attempts to enforce boundaries became more desperate. She started setting screen time limits through parental controls, hoping technology could succeed where her words had failed. He figured out how to bypass them within a day. She tried grounding him, telling him he couldn't go to a friend's house until his grades improved. He snuck out through his bedroom window after she fell asleep. She found out when a neighbor mentioned seeing him walking down the street at 10 o'clock at night. When she confronted him, he lied without hesitation, said the neighbor was mistaken. His ability to deceive her, to look her in the eye and deny reality, shook something fundamental in their relationship. Angela visited the house once during this period, about a month before everything fell apart. She noticed the tension immediately. Her nephew barely acknowledged her presence, didn't come downstairs to say hello, just stayed in his room with the door closed. Angela asked Rebecca how she was holding up. Rebecca gave her that same practiced smile, said everything was fine, that he was just going through a phase. But Angela saw the way her sister's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. She saw the dark circles under her eyes, the weight she'd lost without realizing it. Angela wanted to push, to insist that Rebecca get help, but she didn't. She told herself it wasn't her place. Another regret that would follow her forever. The breaking point came gradually, then all at once. Rebecca decided she needed to take a firmer stance. She told her son that if his behavior didn't improve, there would be real consequences. No more warnings, no more second chances. She would take away the gaming console permanently. She would restrict his internet access. She would do whatever it took to get through to him. He listened to her ultimatum with a blank expression, then said something that chilled her to the bone. He told her she couldn't control him anymore. He told her he didn't need her. And then he went back to his room and closed the door, leaving Rebecca standing alone in the hallway, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. That conversation happened 4 days before she died. It would be one of the last real exchanges they ever had. The final evening of Rebecca Matthews' life began like so many others before it. She clocked out of her shift at the hospital at 11:30, her body aching from 12 straight hours on her feet. The parking lot was nearly empty, lit by flickering overhead lights that cast long shadows across the pavement. Security footage shows her walking slowly to her car, adjusting the strap of her work bag on her shoulder. She stopped at a convenience store on the way home, purchasing milk and bread, the kind of mundane errand that feels impossibly heartbreaking in retrospect. The clerk who rang her up remembered her being polite, but quiet, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. She left the store at 11:52, drove the remaining 6 minutes to Maple Grove Drive, and pulled into her driveway just after midnight. The house was dark except for one window on the second floor, his bedroom. The glow from his gaming monitor created a bluish light that spilled through the curtains, visible even from the street. Rebecca sat in her car for a moment before getting out, a detail captured by a neighbor's doorbell camera that had an angled view of her driveway. Investigators would later analyze that footage frame by frame, trying to understand what she might have been thinking in those final quiet seconds. Was she gathering strength for another confrontation? Was she hoping he'd already be asleep? Whatever thoughts passed through her mind, she eventually opened the car door, grabbed her grocery bag and work bag, and walked toward her front door. Inside, her son was exactly where she expected him to be, planted in front of his computer screen, headset on, controller in hand, completely absorbed in the digital world that had become his refuge from reality. The game he was playing required teamwork, and his teammates could hear him through the microphone. Later, when detectives tracked down these online players, several of them reported that he seemed agitated that night, snapping at people over minor mistakes, his tone more aggressive than usual. One player, a 16-year-old from another state, remembered him saying something strange around 12:30 in the morning. He'd said, "I'm about to deal with something, then I'll be free." Nobody thought much of it at the time. Gamers say things like that all the time. Rebecca entered the house carrying her bags, setting them down in the kitchen. A neighbor 2 doors down, Mrs. Chen, was up late dealing with her own insomnia when she heard voices through the thin walls that separated their homes. The houses on Maple Grove Drive were built close together, and sound traveled easily, especially at night when everything else was quiet. Mrs. Chen couldn't make out specific words, but she recognized the pattern. Rebecca's voice, measured and tired, trying to maintain calm. Her son's voice, louder, defensive, cutting her off. The exchange lasted maybe 3 minutes before Mrs. Chen heard footsteps on stairs, then silence. She assumed the argument had ended the way they always did, with both of them retreating to separate parts of the house. She went back to her book and tried not to listen anymore. But this time was different. Forensic analysts would later reconstruct the sequence of events using a combination of digital evidence, physical evidence, and behavioral analysis. The boy's gaming console logs show that he paused his game at exactly 12:41 in the morning. His phone records reveal something even more disturbing. At 12:37, while his mother was still making her way up the stairs, he had opened his browser and typed a search query into the search bar. The exact words would become a critical piece of evidence at trial, demonstrating premeditation confrontation in a way his defense team could never fully counter. He had searched how to make it look like an accident. He deleted the search history immediately afterward, but nothing is ever truly deleted. Digital footprints remain, waiting to be discovered by people who know where to look. What happened in the next 30 minutes is something investigators had to piece together carefully, respectfully, without sensationalizing the horror of it. Rebecca had gone to her son's room, probably intending to have the same conversation they'd had a dozen times before. Turn off the game, get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll talk about your behavior. But something shifted in those moments. Maybe it was the tone of her voice. Maybe it was the accumulation of months of resentment finally reaching a breaking point. Or maybe it was something darker, something that had been growing inside him for longer than anyone realized. The physical evidence suggested a confrontation that escalated rapidly. There were signs of struggle, objects knocked over, desperation meeting resistance. The medical examiner's report, delivered weeks later, would confirm what detectives suspected from the beginning. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a moment of panic or confusion. The nature of the act demonstrated intent, control, and a disturbing absence of hesitation. Rebecca fought. The evidence made that clear, but she was overpowered by someone who, despite being only 13, was nearly her height and fueled by something beyond normal human emotion. The timeline suggests the struggle lasted several minutes, and then, at approximately 1:14 in the morning, everything went silent. The house settled back into stillness. Mrs. Chen, still awake next door, heard nothing more. She assumed everyone had gone to sleep, but sleep never came for the boy in that house. His console logs showed that he returned to his game at 1:23, resuming exactly where he'd left off. He played for another hour, his teammates noticing nothing unusual about his behavior. He laughed at jokes. He coordinated strategies. He acted like nothing had happened, because in his mind, maybe nothing significant had. At 2:30 in the morning, he finally logged off, shut down his computer, and went to bed. There was no call for help, no moment of panic or regret, no realization of the magnitude of what he'd just done. He simply went to sleep, as if this were just another ordinary night in a life that had stopped feeling anything resembling ordinary a long time ago. Morning came to Maple Grove Drive the way it always did, with sunlight filtering through tree branches and the sound of cars starting in driveways as people headed off to work. The Johnsons next door left at 7:15, waving to a neighbor across the street. Mrs. Chen stepped outside to get her newspaper, glancing briefly at Rebecca's house and noticing nothing unusual. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, which is what makes tragedy so devastating when it finally reveals itself. The world continues turning, completely unaware that everything has already changed. At 7:03 that morning, the boy walked out of his front door wearing jeans and a hoodie, backpack slung over one shoulder. A doorbell camera 3 houses down captured him strolling down the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, his pace unhurried, his expression blank. He looked like any other kid heading to a friend's house on a morning before school. There was nothing in his demeanor that suggested what he was leaving behind. No glancing back at the house, no hesitation in his step. He walked 2 blocks to the home of a classmate named Tyler Brennan, rang the doorbell, and asked if he could hang out for a while. Tyler's mother, Susan, answered the door and was surprised to see him so early. She asked if his mother knew where he was. He said yes, that she'd told him it was fine. Susan had no reason to doubt him. Tyler was still eating breakfast when his unexpected guest arrived. The boy sat down at their kitchen table, accepted a glass of orange juice, and made small talk about an upcoming math test. Susan Brennan would later tell police that nothing about his behavior seemed off. He wasn't nervous or fidgety. He didn't avoid eye contact. If anything, he seemed more relaxed than usual, almost cheerful. He asked if he could watch television while Tyler finished getting ready for school. Susan said yes and went upstairs to get ready for work herself. For 20 minutes, he sat on their couch, flipping through channels, acting like this was a perfectly normal Saturday morning, because in his mind, it probably was. Meanwhile, across town, Angela Matthews was starting to worry. She'd sent her sister a text message the night before, just checking in, asking how she was doing. Rebecca usually responded within a few hours, even if it was just a quick message saying she was tired or busy. But this morning, there was nothing. Angela tried calling at 8:30. The phone rang and rang before going to voicemail. She tried again at 9. Same result. By 9:30, the worry had transformed into something sharper, something that made her hands shake as she dialed for the 3rd time. When Rebecca didn't answer again, Angela grabbed her car keys and drove straight to Maple Grove Drive. She arrived at 10:15, parking on the street in front of her sister's house. The first thing she noticed was Rebecca's car in the driveway, which meant she was home. That should have been reassuring, but somehow it wasn't. Angela walked up to the front door and knocked, calling out her sister's name. Nothing. She knocked harder, pressing her face close to the door, listening for any sound of movement inside. The house was completely silent. She tried the doorknob. Locked. She walked around to the back door, found it locked as well. Peering through windows, she could see into the kitchen and living room. Everything looked tidy, undisturbed. No signs of anyone being home. Where was Rebecca? Where was her nephew? Angela called Rebecca's phone one more time, and that's when she heard it. A faint buzzing sound coming from inside the house. Her sister's phone was in there, ringing, going unanswered. That's when the real panic set in. Rebecca never ignored her phone, especially not when she knew Angela was trying to reach her. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Angela's hands trembled as she dialed 911, her voice breaking as she explained to the dispatcher that her sister wasn't answering, that her car was there but she wasn't responding, that she needed someone to come check on her right away. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking questions, keeping Angela calm, while units were dispatched to the location. 2 patrol officers arrived within 8 minutes. Angela met them on the front lawn, explaining the situation through tears she was struggling to hold back. The officers approached the door, knocked firmly, identified themselves as police. When no one answered, they made the decision to force entry. The door gave way with a single solid kick, swinging open to reveal a quiet, seemingly empty house. The officers entered cautiously, calling out announcements as they moved through the first floor. Kitchen clear, living room clear. Everything looked ordinary, untouched. Then one of the officers started up the stairs, his partner following close behind. Angela waited outside, pacing on the lawn, her heart hammering against her ribs. The officer reached the top of the stairs and moved down the hallway, checking rooms one by one. Bathroom empty, first bedroom empty. Then he reached the master bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently, and what he saw made him freeze. He called out to his partner, his voice tight and professional, the tone every officer uses when they're trying to maintain composure in the face of something horrific. His partner joined him in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then one of them radioed for backup, for detectives, for the medical examiner. The words he used were calm and procedural, but the meaning was devastating. They'd found Rebecca Matthews, and she wasn't going to wake up. Outside, Angela saw the change in the officer's body language when they emerged from the house. One of them approached her slowly, his expression carefully neutral, and asked her to sit down. She knew before he said anything. She knew from the way he looked at her, from the gentle tone of his voice, from the way the world seemed to tilt sideways. He told her what they'd found. He told her how sorry he was, and Angela Matthews collapsed into a grief so profound that witnesses later said it felt like watching someone's soul break in real time. Her sister was gone, and somewhere in this quiet neighborhood, Rebecca's 13-year-old son was still out there, acting like nothing had happened at all. Within minutes of the discovery, the quiet street transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the front yard. Unmarked detective vehicles lined the curb. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion, whispering to each other as they tried to piece together what was happening. Angela sat in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild temperature, answering questions through tears that wouldn't stop falling. When detectives asked her where Rebecca's son was, her face went pale. She hadn't even thought about him. In the shock of losing her sister, she'd completely forgotten to wonder about her nephew. Where was he? Was he safe? Or was he in danger too? Detective Sarah Mendoza, a 15-year veteran with the county's major crimes unit, took lead on the investigation. Her first priority was locating the boy. If something had happened to his mother, he could be a victim too, or a witness, or possibly something worse that nobody wanted to say out loud yet. Mendoza dispatched officers to check the school, nearby parks, anywhere a 13-year-old might go. She also initiated what's called a digital canvas, pulling footage from every doorbell camera, traffic camera, and security system within a half-mile radius. In the modern age, people leave trails whether they know it or not. Mendoza just needed to find his. The first break came from a camera 4 houses down from Rebecca's home. The footage showed the boy leaving his house at 7:03 that morning, walking with purpose but not urgency. He wasn't running. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He was just walking, like any kid on any morning. Mendoza watched the footage 3 times, studying his body language, searching for any sign of distress or panic. There was none. Another camera picked him up at the end of the block, turning left toward the residential area where several of his classmates lived. A third camera, mounted on a garage across the street, captured him checking his phone as he walked. Everything about his behavior suggested normalcy, routine, a typical morning in a typical life. Officers tracked his route block by block, camera by camera, until they located the house where the trail ended. It belonged to the Brennan family. Detective Mendoza arrived there at 11:20, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. Susan Brennan answered the door looking confused and concerned by the police presence. When Mendoza asked if Rebecca Matthews' son was there, Susan's confusion deepened. Yes, he was in the living room with her son Tyler. He'd shown up around 7:15 asking to hang out. Was something wrong? Mendoza's expression remained neutral as she asked if she could speak with him. Susan stepped aside, her maternal instincts suddenly on high alert. The boy was sitting on the couch, controller in hand, playing a video game with Tyler. When he saw the detective enter, his expression barely changed. No fear, no surprise, just a flicker of mild annoyance at the interruption. Mendoza introduced herself calmly, asked if she could speak with him outside for a moment. He shrugged, set down the controller, and followed her to the front porch. Susan Brennan watched through the window, her hand covering her mouth, sensing that whatever was happening was serious. Tyler stood frozen in the living room, game paused, knowing instinctively that something had shifted in his quiet morning. On the porch, Detective Mendoza knelt down slightly, bringing herself closer to his eye level. She kept her voice gentle, non-threatening. She asked him when he'd last seen his mother. He said last night, before he went to bed. She asked what time that was. He shrugged again, said maybe midnight. She asked if everything had been okay when he left the house this morning. He nodded. Yeah, everything was fine. His answers came easily, without hesitation, without the stammering or uncertainty that usually accompanies lying. Either he was telling the truth, or he was remarkably comfortable with deception. Mendoza suspected the latter. She told him there had been an incident at his house, that they needed him to come down to the station to answer some questions. She didn't tell him what had happened to his mother. Not yet. She wanted to see his reaction in a controlled environment, with cameras recording every word and gesture. He asked if he was in trouble. Mendoza said no, they just needed his help understanding what happened. He accepted this explanation without protest, without asking the question that any normal child would ask, "Is my mom okay?" That absence spoke volumes. He walked to the patrol car without resistance, climbed into the back seat, and stared out the window as they drove away. Susan Brennan stood in her doorway, clutching her son, both of them watching the car disappear down the street. During the 15-minute drive to the police station, the boy sat quietly. The officer behind the wheel glanced at him occasionally in the rearview mirror, noting his demeanor. He wasn't crying. He wasn't fidgeting. He was just sitting there, looking out the window like he was on his way to a dentist appointment. At one point, his stomach growled audibly. He asked the officer if there would be snacks at the station. The officer, thrown by the casualness of the question, said he'd see what he could find. The boy thanked him politely and went back to staring out the window. When they arrived at the station, he followed instructions without complaint, walked through the doors, and entered a building he'd never been in before with all the concern of someone buying milk at a grocery store. Detective Mendoza led him to an interview room, a small space with a table, 3 chairs, and a camera mounted in the corner. She offered him water. He accepted. She asked if he was comfortable. He said yes. Then she excused herself, leaving him alone in the room for exactly 12 minutes. This wasn't an accident. Investigators often leave suspects alone initially, watching their behavior when they think no one is paying attention. Some people break down. Some pray. Some rehearse their stories aloud. This boy did none of those things. He leaned back in his chair, tapped his shoe against the table leg in that same rhythm he'd used throughout the coming days, and waited with an expression of complete indifference. He didn't know it yet, but that expression, that casual arrogance, was being recorded, and it would follow him all the way to a courtroom where a judge would make history. Detective Mendoza returned to the interview room at 12:15, accompanied by Detective Marcus Hall, a child forensic specialist trained in questioning minors. They entered quietly, setting down folders and a notepad, deliberately creating a calm atmosphere. The boy watched them with mild interest, his fingers drumming on the table. Hall started with the basics, asking for his full name, his age, his grade in school. The boy answered each question in a flat monotone, offering nothing beyond what was asked. When Hall asked how he was feeling, the boy said fine, just fine, as if this were a routine check-in with a school counselor rather than a police interrogation. Mendoza took over, her approach gentle but direct. She explained that they'd found his mother that morning, that something terrible had happened, and that she wasn't coming home. She watched his face carefully as she delivered the news, searching for any crack in his composure. Most children, when told their parent has passed, react with immediate shock, denial, tears, questions, desperate, frantic questions. He did none of those things. He blinked once, tilted his head slightly, and asked what happened. Not, "Is she really gone?" or "Are you sure?" Just a casual inquiry, the way you might ask about a weather report. Mendoza felt something cold settle in her stomach. She told him they were still investigating, that they needed his help understanding the timeline of the previous night. The boy nodded slowly. Hall asked him to walk them through his evening, starting from when his mother came home from work. He recounted the basics. She got home late. He was in his room. She came upstairs. They talked for a minute. Then he went to bed. Hall asked what they talked about. The boy shrugged, said it was nothing important, just her telling him to get off the computer. Hall asked what time this was. The boy said he didn't really remember, maybe around midnight. His answers were almost too smooth, too prepared, lacking the natural confusion and fragmentation that comes with genuine recollection. Mendoza leaned forward slightly. She asked if they'd argued. The boy's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before relaxing again. "No," he said. "They didn't argue. She just told him to go to sleep, and he did." Mendoza nodded, made a note in her folder, then asked why he'd left the house so early that morning without telling anyone. The boy said he woke up and got bored, so he went to his friend's house. It wasn't unusual for him to do that. His mom knew he went to Tyler's sometimes. This was a lie, of course. Susan Brennan had already told investigators that she'd never seen him show up unannounced that early before. But he delivered the lie with such confidence that if they hadn't already known the truth, they might have believed him. Hall shifted the conversation, asking about the boy's relationship with his mother. Were they close? Did they get along? The boy said they were fine, that she worked a lot so they didn't see each other much. Hall asked if that bothered him. The boy shrugged. "Not really," he said. He was used to it. Hall pressed gently, asking if he ever felt angry at her for being gone so much. The boy's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," he said, his tone sharper now. "Why would he be angry?" Hall backed off, changing direction, asking about school, about friends, about hobbies. The boy relaxed again, talking about his games, his online friends, the normal interests of a 13-year-old. But whenever the conversation circled back to his mother, his responses became clipped, defensive, carefully controlled. Then Mendoza did something that changed the entire dynamic of the interview. She placed a photograph on the table. It was a printout from the doorbell camera, showing him leaving the house that morning at 7:03. She asked him to look at it carefully. He glanced down, then back up at her, his expression unchanged. Mendoza pointed out the timestamp. She noted that he'd told them he left around 8, but the camera showed it was actually just after 7, before most people in the neighborhood were even awake. Why had he left so early? And why had he lied about the time? The boy stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he said he must have remembered wrong. Time is confusing when you're upset. Mendoza asked if he was upset that morning. He said yes, of course, because something bad had happened to his mom. But Hall caught the slip immediately. How did he know something bad had happened? They hadn't told him any details yet. They'd only said there had been an incident. The boy's eyes flickered between the two detectives. He said he just assumed, because why else would they be asking him all these questions? It was a recovery, but not a perfect one. The detectives exchanged a glance that the boy couldn't quite interpret. Mendoza then revealed another piece of evidence. Phone records. She explained that they'd obtained a warrant for his cell phone data and that they'd found something interesting. A search query made at 12:37 in the morning, just minutes before his mother went upstairs. She didn't tell him what the search was yet. She just asked if he remembered using his phone around that time. The boy said no. He'd been playing his game. His phone was charging across the room. Mendoza nodded slowly, then read the search query aloud. How to make it look like an accident. The words hung in the air like smoke. The boy's face remained blank, but his hands, which had been resting casually on the table, slowly curled into fists. He said he didn't search for that. Someone must have accessed his phone. Maybe it was a glitch. Maybe the records were wrong. His voice rose slightly, the first real emotion he'd shown since entering the room. Hall leaned in, his voice calm and reassuring. He said they understood this was stressful, that they just wanted to understand what happened. But the boy wasn't listening anymore. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and said the words that would define him in the public eye for years to come. "I'm 13 years old," he said, his voice cold and certain. "You can't do anything to me." Then he stopped talking entirely, staring at the wall, his jaw set in defiance. The interview was over. But the investigation was just beginning, and the evidence was about to speak louder than any words he could have offered. While the boy sat in that interrogation room, convinced his age would shield him from consequences, a team of forensic analysts was already dismantling his digital life piece by piece. In the modern era, phones and computers are like external memories, storing every search, every message, every moment of activity, whether we remember it or not. Detective Mendoza had obtained warrants for all of his devices within hours of finding Rebecca's body. By the time he uttered those final defiant words in the interview room, analysts had already uncovered a timeline that would prove devastating to any defense his lawyers might attempt to build. The first analyst to break through was a woman named Jennifer Kraft, a digital forensics specialist who'd been with the department for 8 years. She'd seen countless cases where people thought deleting something made it disappear forever. It never did. She connected the boy's phone to her workstation and began the extraction process, pulling data from every corner of the device's memory. What she found made her pause and call Detective Mendoza immediately. The search history wasn't just suspicious. It was a roadmap of premeditation. The query about making something look like an accident had been deleted, but she recovered it within 20 minutes. Then she found more. 3 days before his mother's passing, he'd searched for information about legal consequences for minors. He'd visited multiple websites explaining juvenile justice systems, reading articles about what happened to kids who committed serious offenses. He'd specifically looked up cases where children were tried as adults, seeming to research the boundaries of what he could potentially get away with. 2 days before, he'd searched for sleeping schedules, apparently trying to understand when someone would be most vulnerable. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't a moment of emotional explosion. This was planning, cold and methodical, carried out by someone who believed he'd found a loophole in the system simply by being young. His text messages revealed another layer of the story. Conversations with classmates showed increasing resentment toward his mother over the previous month. He'd complained to one friend that she was always on his case, that she wouldn't leave him alone. To another, he'd written that he wished he could just start over somewhere else without anyone controlling him. Most disturbing was a message sent to a kid he barely knew, someone he'd apparently felt comfortable confiding in because they weren't close. The message, sent 5 days before Rebecca died, read, "What would you do if someone kept ruining your life and wouldn't stop no matter what you said?" The recipient had responded with typical teenage advice, suggesting he talk to a counselor or ignore her. The boy never replied to that message. The gaming console logs provided their own testimony. Analysts discovered that on the night of the incident, he'd paused his game at 12:41, exactly as the earlier analysis had shown. But what they hadn't initially noticed was what happened after he resumed playing at 1:23. His gameplay that night was captured in saved recordings, a feature the game had for players who wanted to review their performances. Investigators watched those recordings with growing disbelief. His play style showed no change. His voice chat showed no stress. He laughed at jokes. He celebrated victories. He acted like someone playing a video game on an ordinary night, not someone who'd just experienced the most traumatic event imaginable. The disconnect was chilling. Lieutenant Chris Santos, who supervised the forensic unit, brought all the evidence together in a presentation for the investigative team. He displayed the timeline on a large screen in the conference room, each piece of digital evidence marked with timestamps. The search queries, the gaming logs, the text messages, the camera footage from neighbors. Everything aligned with brutal precision. Santos pointed out that there was a 9-minute gap between when the boy paused his game and when Rebecca would have reached his room based on her movements through the house. 9 minutes where he had time to think, to reconsider, to make a different choice. He'd used those 9 minutes to search the internet for ways to avoid consequences. That detail alone destroyed any argument of sudden impulse or emotional break. Detective Hall, who specialized in juvenile cases, expressed something that everyone in the room was thinking but hesitant to say aloud. In his 20 years working with minors, he'd never seen this level of detachment combined with this degree of planning. Kids who hurt their parents usually did so in moments of rage, fueled by emotion they couldn't control. They panicked afterward. They confessed quickly, overwhelmed by guilt. This boy had done the opposite. He'd planned. He'd executed. He'd cleaned up. He'd gone to sleep. He'd woken up and left the house like nothing had happened. Then he'd sat in an interrogation room and lied with the skill of someone twice his age. The psychological profile emerging from the evidence suggested something far beyond typical adolescent rebellion. The forensic team also examined the physical evidence collected from the house. Rebecca's bedroom showed signs of a struggle that lasted several minutes. Objects knocked from her nightstand, defensive marks that told a story of someone fighting desperately to survive. The medical examiner's report, which arrived 2 days after the initial investigation began, confirmed that Rebecca had been conscious and aware throughout the attack. She'd known what was happening, she'd tried to stop it. And most heartbreaking of all, she'd likely recognized her attacker. Her own son. The person she'd spent 13 years protecting, nurturing, and loving despite every challenge they'd faced together. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence came from the boy's own bedroom. Crime scene technicians found his gaming headset still plugged in, sitting on his desk next to a half-empty energy drink. They collected it as part of the standard evidence sweep, not expecting it to yield anything significant. But when analysts examined it, they discovered something recorded in its memory buffer. The headset had a feature that saved audio clips automatically, meant to help players review their strategies. One clip had been saved at 1:43 in the morning, 20 minutes after he'd resumed playing. It was just 15 seconds long, captured accidentally when he'd pressed the wrong button. In that clip, you could hear him talking to his online teammates, his voice clear and steady. He was discussing game tactics, laughing at something someone said, completely engaged in the virtual world. In the background, barely audible, was another sound, someone moving around upstairs, or maybe not moving anymore. The timestamp made it impossible to deny. He'd been playing games while his mother lay lifeless just down the hallway, and he hadn't cared enough to even check on her. News of what happened on Maple Grove Drive spread through the community like a shockwave, leaving people stunned and searching for answers that didn't seem to exist. By the second day after Rebecca's body was discovered, local news stations had picked up the story. By the third day, it had gone regional. The details were still scarce, protected by the ongoing investigation, but enough information had leaked for people to understand the basic horror. A nurse had been killed in her own home. Her 13-year-old son was in custody. The implications of those two facts sitting side by side created a kind of cognitive dissonance that the town couldn't reconcile. The school district called an emergency meeting for parents and staff. The auditorium at Jefferson Middle School filled beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles. Principal David Morrison stood at the podium, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. He'd known Rebecca through parent-teacher conferences. He'd dealt with her son's disciplinary issues personally. Now he had to address a room full of terrified parents who wanted to know how this could have happened, and more importantly, how they could protect their own children from becoming victims or perpetrators of similar violence. Morrison had no good answers. He talked about counseling resources. He talked about warning signs. But everyone in that room knew they were grasping at explanations for something that defied easy explanation. Teachers who'd worked with the boy were interviewed by both investigators and reporters. Most of them described him as difficult but not dangerous, defiant but not violent. He'd been disruptive in class, yes. He'd talked back to adults, yes. He'd gotten into arguments with other students, yes. But he'd never physically hurt anyone. He'd never made explicit threats. The warning signs in retrospect seemed obvious, but in the moment, they'd looked like normal teenage rebellion magnified slightly. How were they supposed to know that defiance would escalate into something unthinkable? One teacher, Mrs. Patricia Elwood, broke down during her interview with investigators. She said she'd called Rebecca just 2 weeks earlier to discuss her son's failing grades and disrespectful attitude. Rebecca had apologized, had promised to handle it at home, had sounded so tired. Mrs. Elwood kept thinking about that phone call, wondering if her complaint had somehow contributed to the final confrontation that cost Rebecca her life. The neighborhood itself transformed overnight. Maple Grove Drive, which had always been the kind of place where kids played outside until dark and neighbors borrowed sugar from each other, suddenly felt unsafe. Parents started keeping their children inside. People who'd never locked their doors during the day started setting security alarms. The Johnsons, who'd lived next door to Rebecca, put their house on the market within a week. Mrs. Johnson told reporters she couldn't sleep anymore, knowing what had happened just a few feet away through a shared wall. She kept replaying that night in her mind, wondering if she'd heard something important and dismissed it. Could she have called the police? Could she have saved Rebecca? The guilt was eating her alive, even though investigators assured her there was nothing she could have done. Community vigils became a way for people to process their collective grief. The first one was organized by Rebecca's co-workers at the hospital, held in the parking lot where security cameras had captured her final moments before driving home. More than 200 people showed up, holding candles and sharing memories. Diane, the nurse who'd worked alongside Rebecca for a decade, spoke through tears about her friend's dedication to both her patients and her son. She talked about how Rebecca had always believed in second chances, in the power of love to heal damaged relationships. The irony of that belief, given how her life ended, hung heavy in the air. Someone placed a framed photograph of Rebecca at the center of the gathering, her smile bright and genuine, frozen in a happier time. People left flowers, cards, and stuffed animals around the photo, a makeshift memorial that grew larger each day, but not everyone in the community responded with empathy. As more details emerged about the boy's behavior leading up to the crime, some people expressed anger at the systems that had failed to stop him. Why hadn't the school done more when he threatened another student? Why hadn't Child Protective Services investigated when neighbors reported arguments? Why hadn't anyone recognized that this child was capable of extreme violence? Others pushed back against that narrative, arguing that hindsight made everything look obvious. They pointed out that thousands of kids act out, talk back, and struggle with authority without ever hurting anyone. How was anyone supposed to predict which defiant teenager would cross that unthinkable line? The debate raged in community forums, on social media, in coffee shops and living rooms across the town. The most divisive question centered on what should happen to the boy himself. He was 13 years old, a child, legally and developmentally. Some people argued that his age meant he deserved rehabilitation, not punishment, that his brain wasn't fully developed, that he couldn't fully comprehend consequences the way an adult could, that sending him into the adult criminal justice system would destroy any chance he had of becoming a productive member of society. Others disagreed vehemently. They pointed to the evidence of planning, the cold-blooded execution, the complete lack of remorse. They argued that someone capable of doing what he did, regardless of age, posed a danger to society and needed to be held accountable. The debate wasn't just about one boy. It was about fundamental questions of justice, mercy, and whether some actions are so heinous that age becomes irrelevant. Local advocacy groups began organizing. Families Against Juvenile Violence held rallies demanding that the boy be tried as an adult. On the opposite side, the Coalition for Youth Justice argued that the system existed to protect children, even children who'd done terrible things. Both groups showed up at the courthouse whenever there were hearings, standing on opposite sides of the entrance, holding signs and shouting slogans at each other. The media covered every confrontation, turning a local tragedy into a national conversation about juvenile justice. Rebecca's family, caught in the middle of this firestorm, struggled to make sense of their own feelings. Angela told reporters she wanted justice for her sister, but when pressed on what justice looked like, she couldn't answer. How do you seek vengeance against a child? How do you forgive the unforgivable? How do you honor a woman who spent her life believing in redemption when her belief in redemption might have cost her everything? Through it all, the boy remained in juvenile detention, isolated from the chaos his actions had created. Reports from facility staff described him as compliant but emotionally flat. He followed rules. He attended the required counseling sessions. But he never asked about his mother. He never expressed grief or regret. When a psychologist asked him how he felt about what happened, he said he didn't really feel anything. That admission, more than any evidence presented at trial, would ultimately shape how the world viewed him. Not as a troubled child who'd made a terrible mistake, but as something else entirely. Something that defied easy categorization. Something that made people question everything they thought they understood about childhood, innocence, and the capacity for evil. Dr. Helena Vasquez had been a forensic psychologist for 19 years, specializing in juvenile offenders. She'd evaluated hundreds of children who'd committed everything from theft to assault, and she'd developed what she thought was a comprehensive understanding of how young minds could go wrong. But when she sat across from Rebecca Matthews' 13-year-old son in a sterile evaluation room at the Juvenile Detention Center, she encountered something that challenged every framework she'd built over nearly 2 decades of work. The boy sat with perfect posture, hands folded on the table, looking at her with eyes that seemed simultaneously present and utterly vacant. The evaluation process typically took several sessions, building rapport gradually before diving into difficult questions. Dr. Vasquez started with basics, asking about his childhood, his interests, his relationships. He answered in short, factual sentences, offering no emotional color to his responses. When she asked about happy memories, he struggled to provide any. Not because he was emotional or traumatized, but because he seemed genuinely confused by the question. Happiness, sadness, fear. These concepts appeared abstract to him, like trying to describe colors to someone who'd never seen. When she asked about his mother, his expression didn't change at all. He said she was his mom, she worked at the hospital, she was fine. Present tense. As if she were still alive. Dr. Vasquez noted this detail carefully. Over multiple sessions, a psychological portrait began to emerge that was as disturbing as it was clinically fascinating. The boy demonstrated what Dr. Vasquez identified as severe empathy deficits, meaning he couldn't connect emotionally with other people's experiences. When she showed him photographs of people displaying various emotions and asked him to identify what they were feeling, he performed poorly. Not because he lacked intelligence, his IQ tested well above average, but because the emotions themselves held no meaning for him. A crying face was just a face making a particular expression. It didn't trigger any internal response, any mirror of that sadness. He was observing human emotion from the outside, like a scientist studying an unfamiliar species. The deficits extended beyond emotion recognition into moral reasoning. Dr. Vasquez presented him with ethical scenarios, standard tests used to gauge how children understand right and wrong. A typical 13-year-old, even one with behavioral problems, could explain why certain actions were wrong. They might not always follow those rules, but they understood them. This boy didn't. When asked why hurting someone was wrong, he said, "Because you'll get in trouble." Not because it causes pain, not because it violates someone's rights, but because of external consequences. His entire moral framework was based on punishment avoidance, not on any internal sense of ethics. Right and wrong existed only as categories of what he could get away with. Dr. Vasquez also identified what she called grandiose entitlement, a pattern where the boy believed rules that applied to others simply didn't apply to him. This wasn't unusual in teenagers, who often think they're invincible or special. But his version went deeper. He genuinely couldn't understand why adults had authority over him. He viewed his mother's attempts to set boundaries not as parenting, but as personal attacks, violations of his autonomy that justified retaliation. When Dr. Vasquez asked how he'd felt when his mother restricted his gaming time, he said it made him angry because she had no right to control him. The word right appeared frequently in his responses. He had rights. He deserved freedom. Others were infringing on what belonged to him. Perhaps most chilling was his complete inability to accept responsibility for his actions. Even in private sessions where nothing he said would be used against him in court, he maintained that he'd done nothing wrong. Dr. Vasquez tried multiple approaches, creating a safe space where he could explore his feelings about what happened. He had no feelings to explore. When she asked directly if he felt bad about his mother's passing, he said no. When she asked why not, he shrugged and said he didn't know. He just didn't. It wasn't defiance or manipulation. It was genuine confusion about what emotion he was supposed to be experiencing. The concept of grief was as foreign to him as speaking a language he'd never heard. Dr. Vasquez conducted a series of tests designed to identify specific personality disorders and antisocial traits. The results painted a troubling picture. While she was careful not to diagnose a personality disorder in someone so young, brains continue developing into the mid-20s, the markers were undeniable. Callousness, lack of remorse, shallow affect, manipulative behavior, failure to accept responsibility, poor behavioral controls. These were characteristics typically associated with antisocial personality disorder in adults. Seeing them manifest this clearly in a 13-year-old suggested something fundamental had gone wrong in his psychological development, either through genetics, environment, or some combination of both that science still didn't fully understand. The question of why became Dr. Vasquez's focus in the latter part of her evaluation. She reviewed his developmental history, looking for trauma, abuse, or neglect that might explain his psychological makeup. She found very little. Rebecca had been a devoted mother despite the challenges of single parenthood. She'd provided stability, affection, consistency. There were no reports of physical abuse, no evidence of severe emotional neglect. The boy had been fed, clothed, taken to doctor appointments, enrolled in school. From the outside, his childhood looked unremarkable. Yet somewhere along the way, the normal development of empathy and conscience had simply failed to occur. It was as if the wiring that connects actions to emotional consequences had never formed in his brain. Dr. Vasquez also explored the boy's internal narrative about what happened. How did he explain it to himself? What story had he constructed to make sense of his actions? What she discovered was perhaps the most unsettling finding of all. He didn't have a story. There was no narrative of provocation, no claim that his mother had pushed him too far, no attempt to justify or rationalize. When pressed, he would say she was bothering him about the computer and he wanted her to stop, and then she stopped. That was it. No drama, no emotional climax, just a problem that existed, an action that solved it, and then life continued. The profound absence of moral struggle or internal conflict suggested a mind operating on purely pragmatic terms, solving problems through whatever means proved most efficient without any consideration of ethical dimensions. In her final report to the court, Dr. Vasquez wrote something she'd never written before in nearly 2 decades of practice. She stated that in her professional opinion, the subject demonstrated personality traits that suggested a fundamental incapacity for the kind of empathy and moral reasoning necessary for safe reintegration into society. She recommended long-term secure treatment, possibly extending into adulthood, with regular psychological monitoring. She also noted that the prognosis for significant change was poor. The traits she'd observed tended to be stable over time, resistant to conventional therapy. Some people, she concluded, were simply wired differently, and that difference, when combined with the capacity for violence, created a danger that age couldn't diminish. Her report would become a crucial piece of evidence in the legal battle that was about to unfold, a battle that would force the justice system to confront uncomfortable questions about children, punishment, and the limits of redemption. The grand jury proceedings took place behind closed doors in the county courthouse, a deliberately private process designed to protect both victims and accused while determining whether sufficient evidence existed to move forward with prosecution. 23 citizens, selected from the community, filed into a conference room each morning for a week, listening to testimony and examining evidence that the public wouldn't see for months. District Attorney Christine Palmer stood before them on the first day, knowing the decision she was about to ask them to make would define her career and potentially reshape juvenile justice in the entire state. Palmer had been a prosecutor for 16 years, handling everything from drug offenses to capital cases. She'd dealt with juvenile offenders before, usually advocating for rehabilitation and second chances within the youth system. But this case was different. Everything about it was different. She began her presentation by acknowledging the elephant in the room. The accused was 13 years old, a child by any legal standard. Every instinct in the justice system pushed toward protecting children, even children who'd done wrong. But as she walked the grand jury through the evidence, she asked them to consider whether some acts were so calculated, so devoid of the impulsivity that characterized typical juvenile offenses, that age became less relevant than intent. The grand jurors saw everything: the search history showing premeditation, the text messages revealing resentment and planning, the gaming logs proving he'd resumed normal activities within an hour, the interrogation footage where he'd smirked and declared himself untouchable, Dr. Vasquez's psychological evaluation describing a mind that lacked fundamental human empathy, the forensic timeline showing he'd had multiple opportunities to stop, to reconsider, to call for help, and had chosen none of those options. One juror, a retired teacher named Margaret Chen, later told reporters she'd gone into the proceedings believing strongly that children belonged in the juvenile system. She came out questioning everything she'd thought she knew about childhood and capability. Palmer also presented the legal framework for what she was proposing. State law included a rarely used provision allowing juveniles aged 13 and older to be transferred to adult court under extraordinary circumstances. The statute listed specific criteria: severity of the offense, degree of planning involved, danger to public safety, and likelihood of rehabilitation within the juvenile system. The boy met every single criterion. Palmer argued that keeping him in juvenile custody meant he'd be released at age 21 after serving only 8 years. Given Dr. Vasquez's assessment that his psychological traits were likely permanent, releasing him at 21 posed an unacceptable risk. The adult system allowed for longer sentences and continued supervision into adulthood, protecting both him and society. Defense attorneys, who had limited participation in grand jury proceedings, submitted written arguments against transfer. They emphasized his age, his developing brain, the traumatic environment he'd grown up in despite his mother's best efforts. They cited research showing that adolescent brains lack fully developed impulse control and long-term thinking. They argued that the very fact he believed he was untouchable proved his inability to understand consequences the way an adult would. They pleaded with the grand jury to give him a chance at rehabilitation, to not destroy a child's entire future based on one terrible act. Their arguments were passionate and grounded in established juvenile justice philosophy. But they couldn't overcome the weight of evidence suggesting this wasn't a child who'd made a mistake. This was someone who'd planned, executed, and felt nothing. The grand jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. They requested to see certain pieces of evidence multiple times: the search history, the interrogation footage, Dr. Vasquez's report. Several jurors asked questions about the timeline, trying to understand exactly how much planning had occurred and over what period. They wanted to be certain they weren't making a decision based on emotional reaction to a horrific crime. They needed to believe that transferring a 13-year-old to adult court was legally justified, not just emotionally satisfying. The process was meticulous, thoughtful, and ultimately unprecedented in that jurisdiction. When the grand jury forepersons stood to deliver their decision, the room fell silent. They had voted to indict the boy on charges that included first-degree murder with special circumstances, the special circumstances being the calculated nature of the planning and the vulnerability of the victim. More significantly, they had voted to recommend transfer to adult court, making him one of the youngest defendants in state history to face such a recommendation. The decision wasn't unanimous, but it was overwhelming. 19 of the 23 jurors agreed that the evidence supported transfer. The 4 who voted against it expressed their concerns in written statements. They worried about setting a precedent. They worried about a child spending the rest of his life in prison, but even they acknowledged they had no good answers for what should happen instead. News of the grand jury decision sent shockwaves through the legal community. Defense attorneys called it a travesty, a violation of everything juvenile justice stood for. Victims' rights advocates called it justice, a recognition that some crimes transcend age. The boy's court-appointed attorney, Michael Rashad, immediately filed motions opposing the transfer, arguing it violated his client's constitutional rights. He requested psychological evaluations from independent experts, hoping to counter Dr. Vasquez's findings. He prepared to fight the transfer with every legal tool available. But privately, he told colleagues he'd never handled a case with evidence this damning. Usually there was ambiguity, room for reasonable doubt. Here, there was only clarity, cold and unforgiving. The transfer hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare arguments. In the meantime, the boy remained in juvenile detention, seemingly unbothered by the proceedings swirling around him. Staff reported he spent most of his time reading, playing cards with other detainees, and watching television. He never asked about his case. He never asked about his family. When his Aunt Angela tried to visit, wanting to see if there was any trace of the nephew she'd known, he refused the visit. He told staff he didn't want to see her, didn't want to see anyone from his old life. It was as if he'd simply moved on, treating detention like an inconvenient relocation rather than the consequence of destroying his mother's life. That ability to compartmentalize, to disconnect from reality, would become a central theme in the courtroom battle ahead. A battle that would make legal history and force an entire state to reckon with questions nobody wanted to answer. The transfer hearing began on a cold Monday morning in November, nearly 4 months after Rebecca Matthews had taken her last breath. The courthouse had never seen crowds like this. People lined up before dawn, hoping to secure one of the limited public seats in the gallery. News vans filled the parking lot, their satellite dishes pointing skyward, ready to broadcast every development. Security was tripled after threats had been made against both the prosecution and defense teams. Everyone understood they were witnessing something historic, a legal precedent being forged in real time, and the weight of that history pressed down on the building like physical force. Judge Margaret Thornton presided over the hearing. At 62, she'd spent 3 decades on the bench, handling everything from traffic violations to capital murder cases. She had a reputation for fairness, for listening carefully before making decisions, and for showing neither excessive mercy nor unnecessary cruelty. She'd handled juvenile cases before, always advocating for rehabilitation when possible. But she'd also sentenced adult offenders to life in prison when circumstances demanded it. Now she faced a case that existed somewhere between those two extremes, a 13-year-old defendant who'd committed an act of such calculated violence that every legal category seemed inadequate. She entered the courtroom that first morning looking tired, as if she'd already spent weeks wrestling with the decision she'd eventually have to make. The boy entered through a side door, escorted by 2 juvenile detention officers. He wore clothes his public defender had selected specifically for court appearances: khaki pants, a button-down shirt, shoes instead of sneakers. The goal was to make him look young, vulnerable, like a child who deserved protection. But the effect was undermined by his demeanor. He walked with a casual confidence, glancing around the courtroom with what looked like curiosity rather than fear. When he reached the defense table and sat down next to his attorney, he leaned back in his chair with that same posture he'd displayed in the interrogation room. Relaxed, almost bored. Several people in the gallery noticed and whispered to each other. This wasn't how a frightened child behaved. This was something else entirely. Judge Thornton called the court to order and explained the purpose of the hearing. The state was petitioning to transfer the defendant from juvenile court to adult court based on the severity of the charges and the evidence of premeditation. She would hear arguments from both sides, review evidence, and make a determination based on statutory criteria. She looked directly at the boy as she spoke, perhaps hoping to see some glimmer of understanding about the gravity of his situation. He looked back at her with blank eyes, then yawned. Not a subtle, hidden yawn, a full, open-mouthed yawn that he didn't bother to cover. Judge Thornton's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She continued speaking, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the room. District Attorney Palmer began the state's case by presenting the timeline of evidence. She walked the judge through each piece methodically, building a narrative of calculation and intent. The search queries, the text messages, the gaming logs, the psychological evaluation. Each item was displayed on screens mounted around the courtroom so everyone could see. When Palmer showed the interrogation footage where the boy declared that his age made him untouchable, several people in the gallery audibly gasped. The boy himself showed no reaction. He sat at the defense table, occasionally whispering to his attorney, occasionally looking at his hands, completely disconnected from the damning portrait being painted of him. Defense attorney Rashad countered with arguments grounded in developmental psychology and juvenile justice philosophy. He brought in his own expert witness, Dr. Thomas Brenner, a neuroscientist who specialized in adolescent brain development. Dr. Brenner testified about the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and long-term planning, explaining that it doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. He showed brain scans illustrating the differences between teenage and adult brains. He argued that regardless of how calculated the defendant's actions appeared, his brain literally lacked the capacity for adult-level moral reasoning. The law recognized this reality, which was why juvenile courts existed in the first place. Transferring a 13-year-old to adult court violated the fundamental principle that children were different from adults in ways that mattered legally. But Palmer was ready for this argument. During cross-examination, she asked Dr. Brenner if brain development differences meant teenagers couldn't plan ahead at all. He admitted they could plan to some degree. She asked if brain development meant teenagers didn't know right from wrong. He said no, most teenagers understood basic moral concepts even if their impulse control was weaker. She then presented evidence showing the defendant had demonstrated clear planning ability, had taken steps to avoid detection, had lied strategically to investigators. If his brain was too underdeveloped to understand his actions, how had he managed to execute such a methodical sequence of calculated behaviors? Dr. Brenner struggled to answer. The science said one thing. The evidence said another. The contradiction hung in the air, unresolved. Throughout these exchanges, the boy's behavior grew increasingly problematic. When Dr. Brenner was explaining brain development, the boy rolled his eyes visibly. When Palmer was presenting evidence about his mother's final moments, he examined his fingernails with apparent fascination. When Angela Matthews took the stand to deliver a victim impact statement, describing her sister's devotion and the hole her loss had left in their family, the boy sighed loudly enough for people nearby to hear. Judge Thornton warned him twice about his demeanor, instructing him to sit up straight and show appropriate respect for the proceedings. He complied for approximately 5 minutes before slouching again. The most shocking moment came on the third day of the hearing. Palmer was questioning a forensic expert about the timeline, walking through the sequence of events minute by minute. The expert explained that based on all evidence, the defendant would have had multiple opportunities to call for help, to express remorse, to demonstrate any recognition of what he'd done. Instead, he'd returned to playing video games. As the expert said this, the boy leaned over and whispered something to his attorney. The whisper was meant to be private, but he misjudged the acoustics of the courtroom. Several people heard him clearly. He said, "This is taking forever. When can we leave?" Judge Thornton stopped the proceedings. She asked the defendant to stand. He did so reluctantly with visible annoyance. She asked him if he understood that this hearing would determine the course of the rest of his life. He shrugged. She asked if he understood the seriousness of what he'd been accused of doing. He said, "I guess." His tone was flippant, dismissive, devoid of any weight. Judge Thornton studied him for a long moment, and everyone in that courtroom could see the realization settling over her. This wasn't a frightened child trying to maintain composure. This wasn't someone in shock or denial. This was genuine indifference, a complete disconnect from the moral and legal reality surrounding him. The hearing concluded after 5 days of testimony and argument. Judge Thornton announced she would take 2 weeks to review all evidence and issue a written decision. As the boy was led out of the courtroom, he turned and looked back at the gallery. His eyes swept over Angela Matthews, over Rebecca's co-workers, over the community members who'd come to bear witness. And then, for just a fraction of a second, he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an awkward grimace. A real smile, small and brief but unmistakable. Multiple witnesses reported seeing it. Some thought they'd imagined it, unable to believe a 13-year-old could be that callous. But the courtroom sketch artist had captured it perfectly, and that image would appear in newspapers across the state the next morning. The boy who smiled while his mother's life was dissected for public consumption. The child who felt nothing while the world demanded he feel everything. The smile that would help a judge make the hardest decision of her career. 2 weeks after the transfer hearing concluded, Judge Thornton issued her ruling. In a 38-page written decision, she granted the state's motion to transfer the defendant to adult court. Her reasoning was meticulous, citing not just the severity of the crime, but the pattern of calculated behavior that preceded it, the complete absence of remorse, and the psychological evaluations suggesting a fundamental inability to be rehabilitated within the juvenile system's limited time frame. She acknowledged the rarity and gravity of her decision, noting that she'd spent sleepless nights wrestling with it. But ultimately, she wrote, the evidence compelled only one conclusion. The defendant's age was a fact, but it wasn't the only fact that mattered. The transfer was approved. He would be tried as an adult. The actual trial began 3 months later, in early spring, nearly 9 months after Rebecca's life had ended. The same courtroom that had hosted the transfer hearing now filled with potential jurors, 60 people summoned to determine if they could fairly judge a case this unusual. Jury selection took 4 days. Defense attorney Rashad challenged anyone who admitted they couldn't separate the defendant's young age from the evidence. Palmer challenged anyone who said they could never convict a child regardless of proof. They eventually seated 12 jurors and 4 alternates, a group that included teachers, parents, retirees, and professionals. All of them swore they could render a verdict based solely on evidence. None of them looked comfortable with that oath. Opening statements revealed the core battle lines. Palmer's approach was straightforward. She would prove through evidence that the defendant had planned his mother's demise, executed that plan with cold precision, and felt no remorse whatsoever. Age might explain impulsivity, she argued, but it couldn't explain premeditation. It couldn't explain lies told to investigators. It couldn't explain returning to video games an hour after taking his mother's life. She promised the jury a timeline so clear, so thoroughly documented by digital evidence and forensic science, that reasonable doubt would be impossible. The facts would speak for themselves, and they would demand accountability. Rashad's opening was more emotionally charged. He painted a picture of a troubled child raised in difficult circumstances, struggling with behavioral issues that should have triggered interventions long before tragedy struck. He acknowledged his client had serious problems, but problems weren't the same as evil. A 13-year-old brain, he reminded the jury, was fundamentally different from an adult brain: impulsive, reactive, unable to fully grasp long-term consequences. Yes, terrible things had happened. Yes, Rebecca Matthews deserved justice. But destroying another life, a child's life, through adult punishment wouldn't bring her back. It would only create a second victim. He asked the jury to remember that behind the evidence and the legal arguments sat a human being who'd barely begun his life and who deserved a chance at redemption. The prosecution's case unfolded over 2 weeks, each day adding another layer to an already overwhelming pile of evidence. Palmer started with the digital forensics, calling Jennifer Kraft to the stand to explain what she'd found on the defendant's devices. The jury saw the search history displayed on large monitors. How to make it look like an accident. Legal consequences for minors. What happens if you're under 18? The timestamps next to each search were damning, showing a progression of planning over several days. When Kraft explained that the defendant had deleted these searches, but that deletion didn't mean destruction, several jurors took detailed notes. This wasn't impulse. This was preparation. Detective Mendoza testified next, walking the jury through the interrogation. They watched the full video, 90 minutes of a 13-year-old boy lying with remarkable skill, showing zero emotional response when told his mother was gone, and finally declaring himself untouchable because of his age. The courtroom was silent as the video played. People watched the boy on screen, then glanced at the defendant sitting at the defense table. He looked almost identical to his recorded self. Same blank expression, same casual posture. If being on trial for his mother's life affected him at all, it didn't show. One juror, a woman in her 50s, was seen wiping tears from her eyes as the video ended. The defendant noticed and looked away, seemingly embarrassed by her display of emotion. The forensic timeline was perhaps the most powerful evidence Palmer presented. A specialist named Dr. Raymond Cole had spent months reconstructing the night of the incident using every available piece of data. Phone records, gaming logs, neighbor camera footage, Wi-Fi connection timestamps, audio recordings. He'd created a minute-by-minute breakdown of exactly what happened and when. The jury saw it displayed as an animated timeline on screens, each event marked precisely. Midnight. Rebecca arrives home. 12:37. Defendant searches for ways to avoid consequences. 12:41. Defendant pauses his game. 12:45 to 1:14. The incident occurs based on forensic evidence. 1:23. Defendant resumes gaming. The gaps between events were filled with possibilities, but the timestamps themselves were irrefutable facts. Dr. Cole explained that the 29-minute gap between when the defendant paused his game and when he resumed, it was crucial. That wasn't a moment of impulse. That was nearly half an hour where multiple decisions were made. He'd had time to think, time to stop, time to call for help afterward. He'd chosen none of those options. Instead, he'd cleaned himself up, verified that his mother wouldn't be discovered immediately, and returned to his entertainment as if solving a problem that had been bothering him. When Palmer asked Dr. Cole if this timeline suggested premeditation, Rashad objected immediately. The judge sustained the objection. Drawing legal conclusions was the jury's job, but the implication had already been planted. The testimony of Rebecca's co-workers brought a human dimension to what had been largely technical evidence. Diane Martinez took the stand on the trial's 9th day, her hands trembling as she placed them on the witness box railing. Palmer asked her to describe Rebecca as a person, not just as a victim. Diane's voice broke multiple times as she spoke. Rebecca had been the kind of nurse who remembered every patient's name, who stayed late to comfort frightened families, who brought homemade soup when co-workers were sick. She'd talked about her son constantly, always with a mixture of love and worry. In their final conversation just 3 days before her passing, Rebecca had confided that she felt like she was losing reach, that nothing she did seemed to matter anymore. Diane had told her to stay strong, that teenagers eventually came around. Now, those words haunted her. Angela Matthews returned to the stand, this time not for a victim impact statement, but as a witness to her sister's state of mind in the weeks before she passed. Palmer walked her through their text message exchanges, which had been entered as evidence. The messages painted a picture of a mother at her breaking point, exhausted from working double shifts and then coming home to constant conflict. In one message sent 2 weeks before her passing, Rebecca had written to Angela, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. He looks at me like he hates me." Angela had responded with encouragement, suggestions about family therapy, reassurances that things would improve. She'd had no idea those messages would be read aloud in a courtroom, dissected for clues about what went wrong. The defense's cross-examination of Angela was gentle but pointed. Rashad asked if Rebecca had ever mentioned feeling physically afraid of her son. Angela said no. Rashad asked if there had been any prior incidents of violence in the home. Angela said not that she knew of. Rashad asked if Rebecca had ever called the police or sought protection. Again, no. He was building a narrative that the incident had been an unexpected escalation, not the culmination of a pattern of violence. But Palmer countered on redirect, pointing out that emotional abuse and control often preceded physical violence, that Rebecca might have been afraid to admit the full truth even to her sister, that victims of family violence frequently minimized danger until it was too late. The most technically damaging testimony came from the medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Ross. Her role was to explain what the physical evidence revealed about Rebecca's final moments. Palmer had to walk a careful line here. The jury needed to understand the severity of what happened, but gratuitous details would be both disrespectful to Rebecca's memory and potentially prejudicial to the defendant. Dr. Ross testified in clinical terms, using medical language that conveyed facts without sensationalism. She explained the nature of Rebecca's wounds, the sequence in which they occurred, and the amount of time the attack likely took. The key point was duration. Based on defensive wounds and other evidence, Rebecca had been conscious and fighting for several minutes. This wasn't a single impulsive act. It was sustained violence requiring continued commitment. Dr. Ross also testified about something that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. The positioning of certain evidence suggested Rebecca had tried to speak during the attack, had tried to reach her son emotionally, even as she fought physically. The medical evidence indicated she'd been facing him throughout, that she hadn't turned away or tried to flee. In Dr. Ross's professional opinion, Rebecca had been trying to de-escalate, trying to connect with him as a mother even in those final desperate moments. She'd fought when she had to, but she'd also tried to reach him. That maternal instinct, that belief that love could penetrate even in the worst moment, had been present until the very end. The tragedy was that it hadn't mattered. He'd continued anyway. The defense's expert witnesses tried to reframe the psychological evidence. Dr. Brenner returned to testify about adolescent brain development, this time with more detailed neuroimaging studies showing how teenage brains processed consequences differently than adult brains. He acknowledged that the defendant's behavior was disturbing, but he argued that disturbing didn't mean irredeemable. He cited studies of young offenders who'd committed serious crimes and later, with proper intervention, had become productive adults. The brain's plasticity during adolescence meant change was possible in ways that wouldn't be true for an adult with similar traits. The defendant was 13. His brain wouldn't finish developing for another dozen years. Judging his entire life based on who he was, now ignored the fundamental reality of human development. But Palmer's rebuttal witness, Dr. Vasquez, dismantled that hopeful narrative piece by piece. She acknowledged that brain development was real and important. But she also testified that certain personality patterns, when they emerged this early and this strongly, tended to be remarkably stable over time. The research Dr. Brenner cited involved impulsive crimes, acts committed in anger or fear without planning. The defendant's case was different. The level of premeditation, combined with the complete absence of empathy, suggested something more fundamental than developmental immaturity. She'd evaluated him multiple times over several months. His affect never changed. His lack of remorse never wavered. He never asked about his mother, never expressed curiosity about what happened to her, never showed any indication that her absence affected him emotionally. That wasn't normal teenage detachment. That was something else entirely. Text messages between the defendant and his classmates were read into evidence, showing his mindset in the weeks before Rebecca's passing. In one exchange, a friend had complained about his own parents grounding him for bad grades. The defendant had responded, "Parents think they own you. They don't. You should do what you want." In another conversation he'd written, "My mom keeps trying to control everything I do. I'm not going to deal with it much longer." The defense argued these were typical teenage complaints, the kind of thing millions of kids said without meaning anything sinister. But Palmer noted the dates. These messages were sent in the same time frame as his internet searches about legal consequences for minors. Taken together, they suggested someone not just complaining but actively contemplating solutions. The gaming footage became an unexpected point of contention. The prosecution obtained recordings from the night of the incident showing exactly what the defendant had been doing before and after. The jury watched him play, heard his voice through the headset communicating with teammates. The most disturbing moment came from footage recorded at 1:43 in the morning, just minutes after he'd resumed playing. He was laughing at a joke another player made. His voice sounded completely normal, relaxed, engaged. Palmer paused the video and asked the jury to look at the timestamp again. 1:43, less than 30 minutes after his mother had taken her last breath. And he was laughing. The juxtaposition was devastating. Several jurors looked away from the screen, unable to reconcile what they were hearing with what they knew had just happened. The defense tried to argue that dissociation and shock could explain his behavior, that children in traumatic situations sometimes responded with inappropriate affect because their minds couldn't process what happened. But the prosecution countered with his interrogation footage, where he'd lied strategically and declared himself untouchable. That wasn't dissociation. That was calculated self-preservation. The jury was left to decide which interpretation fit the evidence better: a traumatized child disconnecting from reality, or a calculating individual who simply didn't care what he'd done. The answer to that question would determine everything. By the time the evidentiary phase concluded, Palmer had presented 43 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. The timeline was complete. The digital trail was undeniable. The psychological profile was chilling. Rashad had mounted a vigorous defense, emphasizing youth, brain development, and the possibility of rehabilitation. He'd humanized his client as much as possible, reminding the jury that beneath the evidence sat a child whose life hung in the balance. But he couldn't explain away the central facts: the planning, the execution, the return to normalcy, the complete absence of remorse. Those facts sat in the courtroom like stones, heavy and immovable, waiting for 12 people to decide what they meant and what should happen because of them. Closing arguments began on a Friday morning under gray skies that seemed to match the mood inside the courthouse. The gallery was packed as it had been throughout the trial, with people standing along the back wall and sitting in the aisles until fire marshals forced them out. Those who couldn't get inside gathered on the courthouse steps, waiting for news. The case had become a national story, debated on cable news shows and social media, dissected by legal experts and armchair analysts. Everyone had an opinion about what should happen, but only 12 people's opinions actually mattered, and they sat in the jury box looking exhausted from weeks of testimony that had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about children, violence, and justice. District Attorney Palmer approached the jury box with the weight of the entire case on her shoulders. She'd built what she believed was an irrefutable argument, but she also knew that asking a jury to convict a 13-year-old of first-degree charges was asking them to do something psychologically difficult. She had to give them permission to follow the evidence wherever it led, even if that destination felt wrong on an instinctive level. She began by acknowledging the elephant in the room. The defendant was young. That was a fact no one disputed. But youth didn't erase agency. Youth didn't eliminate choice. And youth didn't excuse calculation. She reminded them of the timeline they'd seen, the searches, the lies, the complete absence of any behavior suggesting remorse or recognition of wrongdoing. Palmer walked the jury through the evidence one final time, but she did it differently now. Instead of presenting facts chronologically, she organized them thematically. First, premeditation. The searches about legal consequences, the queries about making things look accidental, the text messages expressing resentment. Second, execution. The pause in his gaming, the duration of the attack, the conscious choices made during those 29 minutes. Third, consciousness of guilt. The lies to investigators, the strategic deflections, the declaration that his age made him untouchable. Fourth, absence of remorse. The return to gaming, the behavior at his friend's house, the demeanor in interrogation and throughout trial. Each theme built on the previous one, creating a portrait of someone who knew what he was doing, chose to do it anyway, and felt nothing about it afterward. But Palmer saved her most powerful argument for last. She asked the jury to think about Rebecca Matthews, a woman who'd worked double shifts to provide for her son, who'd believed in second chances and redemption, who'd tried every approach she could think of to reach a child who was slipping away from her, who'd fought for her life in her own bedroom while her son, the person she'd loved more than anyone in the world, attacked her with calculation and purpose. Rebecca had deserved better. She'd deserved a son who valued her sacrifices. She'd deserve to grow old, to see grandchildren someday, to retire from the job she'd dedicated her life to. Instead, she'd gotten 29 minutes of terror followed by a silence her son never bothered to break. Justice for Rebecca meant holding her killer accountable, regardless of how old he was when he stole everything from her. Defense attorney Rashad faced an almost impossible task in his closing. He couldn't deny the evidence. The facts were the facts. So instead, he reframed the question the jury needed to answer. Yes, terrible things had happened. Yes, his client bore responsibility. But the question wasn't whether something bad had occurred. The question was what that responsibility looked like for a 13-year-old whose brain was still developing, whose capacity for change was still possible, whose entire life stretched ahead of him. Rashad reminded the jury of Dr. Brenner's testimony about adolescent brain development, about the prefrontal cortex that wouldn't finish maturing for another decade. He asked them to consider that the same boy who'd made devastating choices at 13 might be capable of understanding and remorse at 23 or 33 if given the chance. Rashad also challenged the narrative that his client was uniquely evil or irredeemable. He pointed out that the prosecution's entire case rested on the absence of expected emotional responses. But what if, he suggested, his client simply didn't know how to express emotion appropriately? What if years of being raised by a single mother who worked constantly had left him emotionally stunted, unable to process feelings the way other children could? What if his blank affect wasn't callousness, but confusion? A child so overwhelmed by what happened that he'd shut down completely. The evidence could support that interpretation too, and when evidence supported multiple interpretations, the law required choosing the one most favorable to the defendant. That was what reasonable doubt meant. He acknowledged his client's behavior in court had been problematic. The eye-rolling, the sighs, the apparent indifference. But he reminded the jury that courtrooms were terrifying, alien environments for anyone, especially children. What looked like arrogance might actually be a coping mechanism, a way of maintaining control in a situation where he had none. Rashad's voice grew passionate as he concluded. He asked the jury to imagine their own children or grandchildren at 13. Remember how impulsive they were, how poor their judgment could be, how they seemed to think consequences didn't apply to them. Now multiply those traits by difficult circumstances and behavioral problems. That was his client, not a monster, just a deeply troubled child who'd made the worst possible choices and now needed guidance, not destruction. The judge's instructions to the jury took 90 minutes explaining the law they needed to apply and the standards they needed to meet. To convict on first-degree charges, they had to find proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant had acted with premeditation and deliberation. They had to believe he'd planned the act, understood what he was doing, and carried it through with conscious intent. Age was a factor they could consider, but it wasn't a complete defense. If the evidence proved the elements of the crime regardless of the defendant's age, conviction was appropriate. The jury listened intently, some taking notes, others just absorbing the weight of what they were being asked to do. They began deliberations at 2 p.m. The waiting began immediately, that strange suspended time when lawyers, families, reporters, and spectators had nothing to do but sit and wonder what was happening behind closed doors. The defendant was returned to a holding cell. Angela Matthews sat in the victim services room, surrounded by Rebecca's co-workers, praying for a verdict that would honor her sister's memory. Defense attorney Rashad paced the hallway, second-guessing every choice he'd made during trial. Palmer sat in her office reviewing her closing argument, wondering if she'd said enough or too much. Everyone waited. Hours passed. 4 o'clock came and went. 6 o'clock arrived. The judge sent word that deliberations would continue into the evening. At 8:30, the jury sent out a note requesting to review specific pieces of evidence. The gaming footage, the interrogation video, Dr. Vasquez's report. They were taken back to the jury room and spent another 2 hours reviewing. At 10:45, another note arrived. They'd reached a verdict. The courthouse, which had been settling into nighttime quiet, suddenly exploded into activity. Lawyers were called, family members rushed back, reporters scrambled into the courtroom. Within 30 minutes, everyone was assembled again, the gallery packed with people who'd been waiting all day for this moment. The defendant was brought back into the courtroom. For the first time in the entire trial, he looked slightly uncertain. Not frightened exactly, but less confident than before. Maybe the jury's lengthy deliberation had finally penetrated his belief that he was untouchable. Or maybe he just wanted this to be over. He took his seat next to Rashad, who put a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of support that looked more automatic than genuine. The jury filed in, none of them looking at the defendant. Lawyers know that's usually a bad sign for the defense. When juries have acquitted, they often look at the defendant with something like relief or sympathy. When they've convicted, they avoid eye contact, unable to face the person whose fate they've just sealed. Judge Thornton asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged man who taught high school mathematics, stood and said they had. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete that the sound of paper rustling seemed loud as the clerk retrieved the verdict forms. Judge Thornton reviewed them briefly, her expression revealing nothing, then handed them back. She instructed the defendant to stand. He did, slowly, Rashad standing beside him. The judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict on count 1. First-degree intentional harm resulting in loss of life. The foreperson's voice was steady but quiet. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Angela Matthews sobbed into her hands. Rebecca's co-workers embraced each other, crying. Some spectators cheered before being quickly silenced by Judge Thornton's gavel. Others sat stunned, processing what they'd just heard. A 13-year-old boy had just been convicted of first-degree charges in adult court. It had actually happened. The defendant himself stood frozen, his face displaying the first genuine emotion anyone had seen from him in months. Shock. His mouth opened slightly, his eyes widened. For just a moment, the mask of indifference cracked completely, revealing something underneath that might have been fear or disbelief or the sudden crushing realization that he wasn't untouchable after all. The smirk that had defined him throughout this entire ordeal finally, definitively, disappeared. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks after the verdict, giving both sides time to prepare arguments about what punishment fit a crime this severe committed by someone this young. The legal landscape was uncharted territory. State law allowed for juvenile offenders transferred to adult court to receive what was called a blended sentence, meaning they would serve time in juvenile facilities until reaching adulthood, then transfer to adult prison to complete their sentence. But the maximum lengths, the specific terms, the conditions of supervision, all of it required careful consideration because whatever Judge Thornton decided would set precedent for future cases. She held the power to define what justice looked like when a child committed an adult crime. The courtroom filled once again, though the atmosphere was different now. The uncertainty was gone. Guilt had been established. Now the question was simply how much that guilt would cost. The defendant entered looking smaller somehow, diminished by the verdict in ways his physical appearance couldn't quite explain. He wore the same type of clothing his attorney had selected throughout trial, but it hung differently on him now. He moved to the defense table without his previous casual confidence, sitting down and staring at the table surface rather than surveying the room. The jury had broken something in him, or at least cracked the armor he'd worn for so long. Victim impact statements came first. Angela Matthews approached the podium with photographs of her sister clutched in her hands. She'd prepared written remarks but could barely get through them, her voice breaking every few sentences. She talked about Rebecca's dedication to nursing, her love for her son despite everything, her dreams for a future she'd never see. She described the hole Rebecca's absence had left in their family, the holidays that would never be the same, the milestones Rebecca would miss. She looked directly at her nephew as she spoke, searching his face for any sign of recognition or remorse. His expression remained blank, though his hands trembled slightly on the table. Angela's final words were simple but devastating. "My sister gave you everything, and you gave her nothing but pain. I hope you spend the rest of your life thinking about what you took from all of us." Rebecca's co-workers spoke next, one after another, sharing memories that painted a picture of a woman who dedicated her life to caring for others. Diane Martinez described coming to work the day after learning about Rebecca's passing, walking past her empty locker, and breaking down in the hallway. She talked about patients who still asked about Rebecca months later, people Rebecca had cared for who didn't know she was gone. She addressed the defendant directly, asking him a question she knew he wouldn't answer. "Did you ever love her at all? Did you ever see how hard she tried for you?" The defendant shifted in his seat but said nothing. His attorney had advised him not to respond to victim statements, a strategic choice that looked like callousness to everyone watching. Dr. Vasquez submitted an updated psychological evaluation based on her observations of the defendant throughout the trial. Her conclusions hadn't changed. If anything, his behavior during proceedings had reinforced her initial assessment. He continued to show no genuine remorse, no empathy for his mother or her family, no indication that he grasped the moral dimensions of what he'd done. She recommended a lengthy sentence in secure facilities with mandatory psychological treatment, acknowledging that the prognosis for significant change remained poor, but arguing that treatment should still be attempted. She also recommended he not be released before age 35 at the earliest, giving him time to mature beyond adolescence while protecting public safety during the years when recidivism risk was highest. The defense presented their own witnesses arguing for leniency. A social worker testified about the challenges of single-parent households and the lack of mental health resources available to families struggling with behavioral problems. She suggested that with intensive therapy and proper support, the defendant could eventually develop the empathy and moral reasoning he currently lacked. A juvenile justice advocate argued that sentencing a 13-year-old to decades in prison violated international human rights standards and accomplished nothing except vengeance. He cited studies showing that harsh sentences for juveniles didn't deter crime and often made offenders more dangerous by exposing them to adults' prison environments at vulnerable ages. The arguments were passionate and grounded in real concerns about how society treats its youngest offenders. But District Attorney Palmer countered each point methodically. She noted that the defendant's single-parent household had been stable and loving, that his mother had provided everything she could despite working constant hours. This wasn't a case of neglect or abuse creating a damaged child. This was a child who'd had advantages and support, and had chosen violence anyway. As for rehabilitation, Palmer pointed to his complete lack of engagement with counseling services in juvenile detention. He attended because he had to, but staff reported he showed no insight, no progress, no indication he was even trying to change. How could they release him back into society when he'd demonstrated zero capacity for the empathy required to function safely around other people? Judge Thornton listened to everything, taking notes, asking occasional clarifying questions. When all testimony concluded, she announced she would take 1 week to consider the appropriate sentence before issuing her decision. That week felt endless to everyone involved. Angela couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop wondering if justice for her sister meant a teenager spending his life in prison, or if there was some other answer she couldn't quite see. The defendant spent the week in his cell, reportedly reading and playing cards with other detainees, seemingly unbothered by the fact that his entire future hung in the balance. The disconnect between the gravity of the situation and his response to it remained as stark as ever. The sentencing hearing reconvened on a Thursday morning in late summer, almost exactly 1 year after Rebecca Matthews had died. Judge Thornton entered the courtroom carrying a folder that contained her written decision. She instructed the defendant to stand, then began reading from her notes. She acknowledged the difficulty of the decision she'd reached, the competing concerns of justice, mercy, rehabilitation, and public safety. She noted that she'd reviewed hundreds of pages of testimony, psychological evaluations, case law, and statutory guidelines. She'd consulted with colleagues, reviewed precedents from other jurisdictions, and spent sleepless nights wrestling with what the right answer might be. Then she delivered her ruling, and it made history. She sentenced the defendant to 40 years in prison, but structured it as a blended sentence that acknowledged his age while prioritizing public safety. He would serve his juvenile years until age 21 in a secure juvenile facility with intensive psychological treatment. If evaluations at that time showed significant progress and genuine rehabilitation, he could potentially remain in a juvenile setting until age 25 under continued supervision. However, if evaluations showed he remained a danger, if he continued to show the same lack of empathy and remorse that had defined him throughout this process, he would transfer to adult prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. He would be eligible for parole review at age 35, but only if he could demonstrate substantial rehabilitation. It was the longest blended sentence ever imposed on a juvenile in that state's history. Judge Thornton explained her reasoning carefully. The defendant's age mattered, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. The planning involved, the absence of remorse, the psychological evaluations suggesting fundamental deficits in empathy, all of these factors required a sentence that prioritized public safety while still offering a pathway to rehabilitation if he proved capable of change. She noted that the sentence allowed for flexibility based on his progress, acknowledging that adolescent brains could change in ways adult brains couldn't. But it also ensured that if he remained dangerous, society would be protected from him well into his adulthood. The sentence balanced competing values in a way that no previous juvenile case had attempted. The courtroom's reaction was mixed. Some people applauded, believing justice had been served. Others sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that a 13-year-old would spend at least 2 decades locked away. Angela Matthews wept quietly, unclear whether what she felt was satisfaction or just exhaustion after a year of unimaginable grief. The defendant himself showed no visible reaction to his sentence. He simply nodded once when Judge Thornton asked if he understood the terms, then sat back down. Even facing 40 years in prison, he couldn't summon the emotional response that everyone expected, that any normal person would feel. That absence spoke louder than any words could have. In the months and years that followed, the case became a touchstone in debates about juvenile justice, brain development, and the limits of rehabilitation. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing Judge Thornton's blended sentence approach. Advocacy groups on both sides cited the case as evidence for their positions. Some argued it proved the system could balance competing concerns appropriately. Others argued it demonstrated how fear and anger could override commitment to treating children differently than adults. The defendant became known in some circles as the boy who felt nothing, a shorthand for a type of juvenile offender that challenged every assumption about childhood, innocence, and the possibility of redemption. Rebecca Matthews' legacy lived on in unexpected ways. Her co-workers at the hospital established a scholarship fund in her name for nursing students who demonstrated exceptional compassion. Angela started a support group for families affected by violence committed by their own relatives, recognizing that these secondary victims often suffered in isolation. The neighborhood where Rebecca died slowly healed, though Maple Grove Drive would never quite feel the same. Parents held their children a little tighter. People locked their doors more carefully. And everyone who'd followed the case carried away a truth they wished they didn't know, that evil could wear the face of a child, that love couldn't always save the people determined to destroy themselves, and that justice, when it finally came, felt less like victory than just the end of a story that should never have been written. The boy who'd smirked in the interrogation room, who'd declared himself untouchable, who'd felt nothing as his mother fought for her life. He was no longer untouchable. The system he'd thought couldn't reach him had reached him after all. Whether it would change him, whether decades in custody would build the conscience he'd never developed, whether he'd eventually feel remorse for the woman who'd loved him more than he could understand, those questions remained unanswered. What was certain was simpler and starker. He'd thought he was above consequences because of his age. A judge had proven him wrong, and that gavel falling in that courtroom had made history, setting a precedent that would echo through juvenile justice systems for generations. Rebecca Matthews couldn't be brought back, but perhaps her death had ensured that others would be protected from children who believed, as her son once did, that being young meant being untouchable. That small truth had to be enough, because it was all that remained.